So now we're recording. And there's this is session number 2 of the third installment of the Complete Beginner's Guide to the Talmud. And this week we're going to be talking about internal logic that the Talmud uses not as a way to kind of understand how a pasuk gets the halacha, which is what we did last week, but just questions the Talmud is asking all the time and using within itself questions maybe the Talmud is asking about a Mishnah, questions the Talmud is asking maybe about a statement by an Amora, questions the Talmud might be asking about a Breita. And you'll get a feel for it once we dive in. For those of you who might not remember from last week, just a little bit of housekeeping. So I'll talk for about 50 minutes, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. If you don't have questions, that's totally okay. But if you do have questions while we go, just write them down somewhere, or you can even put them in the chat if you want. But then I'll give some people like, okay, put all your questions back in the chat now, and that'll help me kind of go through at the end. So there'll be time for Q&A at the end. We're not going to be unmuting, so have all your questions written out. So that's the piece of housekeeping. And also, there's going to be another quiz posted. There was a quiz posted on last week's material. It's just a way to review the concepts that we learned. So you get to practice, like, oh, this is a Havamina that incorporates the principle of Deo. This is a bad Havamina. Sorry, not a Havamina. This is a Kal V'chomer. Today we're talking about Havaminas. This is a Kal V'chomer that incorporates the concept of Deo. This is a Kal V'chomer that does not. Things like that. Xer Shava, like different, just to practice identifying the different kinds of logic and making sure we're really strong on how they work. So that is up from last week's class. One for this week's class will get posted midweek. And some people asked me like, oh, can you send out the slides in advance? So unfortunately, we can't do that. But if you want, the slides do get posted when the recordings go up. So if you are watching the recording, you can certainly download the slides and take notes straight on there. And if you're with us live, which is so amazing, obviously, and you guys get to ask questions, so big benefits. Then just know that the slides will eventually go up. So you can like scribble like just the name or whatever the top of the slide, and then you'll be able to find it later when the slides go up at the end. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen. No. Okay. Okay, so our first concept for today is called a pshita. And if you're like, oh, pshita, that's so obvious. Haha, good for you. That's what it means. Okay, so pshita, it's obvious, but in the world of the Gemara, that's not a good thing, right? So sometimes we think, wow, you just wrote with such clarity. What a beautiful thing. No, in the Gemara, if it's too clear, if it's too obvious, then we're like, oh, didn't even need to be said. It's so obvious. Why are you telling me this? So that's pshita. And what that means is that pshita is pointing out a problem. Pshita, it's too obvious. And where that's going to lead is into an explanation of why a teaching is less obvious than you might have thought. So pshita is like, oh, it seems so obvious, but that kind of critique is then going to lead into a teaching. No, it's less obvious than you're imagining. So just to look at two kind of examples where the Gemara says, oh, pshita, like this is too obvious. So we're back in the world. We're back in the Yoma 85-ish. We were here last week also, in the world of Pikuach Nefesh. So Mishnah Aflalav Mapolet, with regard to someone who is underneath, Rahman al underneath a rock slide, and there's uncertainty whether he's alive or whether he's dead, Safek Chai, Safek Meat. What are you supposed to do? Mefakhin alav et hagal. They're supposed to clear the debris from on top of him. Matza'u chai, and if they find that he's alive, mifakhin. If they find that he's alive, then they keep going. They keep extricating him. Ve'im mate yenichu. But if you realize that he's dead, then you leave him because we don't desecrate Shabbat to preserve the dignity of the dead. That's why we also like don't bury on Shabbat, for example. And then not to say you would then like leave the body there forever, but you would leave it until after Shabbat, and then you would extricate the body. So The Gemara says, "Mitza'u chai mefakchim." Okay, the fact that if you find a person who's alive, you continue to extricate. Matzu chai pshita, says the Gemara, right? It's obvious you find him alive. You're only digging in there to find live people. Of course, if you find a live person, you take them out, says the Gemara. So they say, lo, tzricha, no. It is necessary, and we're going to talk more about this word tzricha in a little bit. No, it's necessary to teach this. What if a person is like only a little bit alive? Again, Rahman al right? The person you're like, oh, I think this person is like gonna die within moments, but they're alive now. You can keep digging them out. So that actually, what the Pshita does is it teaches you something less obvious. It points out, oh, it seems like this thing was obvious. And then the Gemara is going to come in and say, no, here's the non-obvious thing. Here's the delicate thing that this text is trying to teach you and that this principle allows for that that is much less obvious than the accusation of Pshita would have accounted for. And then by pointing out the obvious point in the Mishnah, the Gemara is able to kind of bring out that not obvious point. So like, what's the point of saying a Pshita, right? The point of saying a Pshita is not like to make fun or to be like, haha, you said something stupid. Like, no, that's not what's happening here with a Pshita. With a Pshita, the point is we're going to point out the obvious thing, and then we're going to defend the teaching by bringing out the not obvious thing, and that's where the real learning is going to happen. But you can only do that once you, in the world of the Gemara, you can only do that once you have excavated what's the obvious thing. Okay, now I can bring out the not obvious thing. Okay, here's another example. So we have a Mishnah in Masachet Brachot, Nashim Avadim Ktanim, Pturim Mikriyat Shema Minat Tefillin. So women, slaves, and minors, are one of our favorite triumvirates, are exempt from the recitation of Shema and from laying tefillin. Chayavin b'tfilah uvemezuzah uvebirkat hamazon, but they're obligated in the mitzvot of prayer, mezuzah, and grace after meals, benching. The Gemara says, okay, women's exemption from Kriyat Shema is obvious. It's pshita, right? Kriyat Shema, pshita. Mitzvah seisha zman garmanu. It's a time-bound positive commandment, and we have a principle, kol mitzvot seisha zman garman nashim pturot, and we know that women are exempt from all time-bound positive mitzvot. So the Mishnah didn't even need to tell me that women are exempt from Kriyat Shema. Kriyat Shema, it's obvious because it's time-bound positive commandment. All right, so we're going to come back to this Gemara in a minute, but before we do that, we're going to introduce another term. And that term is Havamina. Havamina is like our big term of the day. Okay, so what is a Havamina? I would have said, I might have thought. I like to call it a what would I have thought experiment. Like a thought experiment, but what would I have thought experiment? Okay. But I'll just imagine that you're all laughing behind your muted screens. So a what would I have thought experiment, a Havamina, is always rejected, but it's meant to be educational. And as with last week with Kal V'chomer, there's a lot of different language for Havamina. We're going to introduce, I think, a lot of it, quite a lot of it, in the following slides. You don't need to memorize it or anything like that, but just know, right, this is one of those kind of logical or pedagogic tools that the Gemara uses all over the place. Even when it doesn't tell you it's using a Havamina, it's often using a Havamina. And what that means for you as a learner is you always want to make sure you understand, is the Gemara saying this because it believes it? Or is the Gemara saying this because it's raising a Havamina? It's raising a I might have thought. And the reason, similar to the Pshita, the reason why you're going to raise a I might have thought is to teach you, A, not to think that thing, but B, what you're, yes, supposed to think in like relief of the Havamina. So, and we have just, we'll start here with some alternative language. So Havamina is obviously one language we'll use for it. Mahu Datima, what was it that you would have supposed? What would you have thought? I.e., like, what was your Havamina? So it says this. If it hadn't said this, what would you have thought it would be, or something like that? We're gonna see Ma'odatima in a minute. And Ma'odatima is typically coupled with Kamash Malan. It comes to teach us Kamash Malan. two other options for Havamina. Silka daitach amina. It would have occurred to you that I might say Kasilka daitach. It occurs to your mind slash you would assume. Okay, so a Havamina very frequently comes as a response to a claim of Pshita, and that's what we already saw, right? Pshita, this teaching seems obvious. Azoi, without that teaching, what would you have thought? And that's why we had that language of tzricha also coming to teach you. What would you have thought? It's necessary to teach this because otherwise you might have thought that the person who's alive only for chaye sha'a, like he's alive, he's just a little bit alive under the mapolet, under the rockfall. What you might have thought, your havamina might have been, maybe I leave this person. It's not going to get better for them if I extricate them. Like maybe the merciful thing to do is to leave them. Maybe because it's the merciful thing to do to leave them, I can't extricate them on Shabbos. I don't know, a million things, right? You might have thought any of that. So that's why it has to say, no, if they're alive, if they're at all alive, you continue to extricate them, right? But the havamina is that you wouldn't extricate them. And so the Pshita says, oh, this teaching seems so obvious. No, it comes to teach you not to believe in the Havamina that would have occurred to you. Okay, so let's continue back in our Pshita number 2 example, Brachu 20b. So we've already seen our Mishnah. We've already seen our Pshita, right? Women obviously are exempt from Kriyat Shema because the mitzvah seishes magraman. Now we get to our Havamina. Ma'hu detema, lest you say, is how they translate it here. What might you have thought? Ho'io ve'it ba malchut shamayim kamash malan. So since the Shema includes the acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, you might say that overrides. Okay, I have some principle about women's exemption from time-bound positive commandments, but the acceptance of Ol Malchut Shamayim, of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, maybe that overrides the time-bound nature of it. That's too important. Or maybe like that the heart of it is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, not anything relating to the time. So the time thing is secondary and this is primary, and the primary piece isn't time-bound. You could say it a lot of ways, right? But in any event, right, all of that leads to a havamina that women would, yes, be obligated in Kriyat Shema, and that's why it's not obvious that women are not obligated in Kriyat Shema. So let's do it again. On the same Mishnah, we have another Pshita. Women are also exempt from tefillin. The Gemara then says, Pshita, obvious that women are exempt from tefillin. Ma'odetema, no, there's, what might you have thought? What was your havamina that women would not be exempt from tefillin? Ho'il ve'it kasha mezuzah. Tefillin and mezuzah are juxtaposed in the Torah, right? You might be familiar with that from Kriyat Shema. Tefillin and mezuzah are juxtaposed. They come together. Women are obligated, yes, in mezuzah. We even see that in this Mishnah. So you might have thought obligated in putting the word of God onto your doors. Surely you're obligated in putting the word of God onto your body. Those seem like the same thing even. And so the Gemara has to say, yeah, Kamash Malan. That's why we need the Mishnah to tell us, no, women are exempt from tefillin, categorically. Okay, so right, hopefully you're starting to get the feeling. Pshita, Ma'odetema, Kamash Malan is a very common form that you see all over the Gemara. Oh, this teaching, in our case in the Mishnah, is obvious. No, if we hadn't taught that teaching, what would you have thought? And the Kamash Malan just comes to, bang it on the head. That's why it is. That's why it has to teach us that. So in a way, the Kamash Malan, it comes together with the Mahudatima, but it's the response to the Pshita, right? The Pshita is, this is obvious. Kamash Malan, no, it's coming to teach you something important and subtle and not obvious. You might have thought about it differently. Okay, so just to kind of lay out like Pshita, Havamina in the real world. So in our regular lives, Pshita claims are typically accusations of condescension or micromanagement. Duh, you think I'm so stupid? I couldn't have figured that out for myself. And the way out of a claim like that is to explain why actually it's not so obvious. So an example would be, please lock the door when you leave the house. I know, I've left the house before. Like, why are you telling me this? I know that we lock the door when we leave the house, obviously. And then you say, no, what was the Havamina? You might have thought that the kids were still playing outside. If you lock the door on your way out, you're going to lock them out. So actually, I did need to tell you, please lock the door when you leave the house, even though a million times you've locked the door on your way out of the house, right? So by saying, "Oh, there's a havamina," it works against the pshita. It says, "Oh, the pshita is not it's not as obvious as you think because you would have thought this other thing." Okay, so this is more, we're still in the world of Havamina. We have a lot more Havamina vocabulary. So another way of saying it is lema or nema. Let us say, shall we say? And these terms, they're used interchangeably. They introduce a proposal that's going to be rejected in the course of the Talmudic discussion. So this is much less like, oh, I read the Mishnah and now I have a question. It's much more like an attempted way of thinking about some text or some question. Let's say the following, or like, can we try this out? Here's where we really get into like thought experiment land. Lema, the following, right? So here's our example. I didn't even bring you the whole thing, just like one sentence. Lema matnitin de lo Rabbi Yossi. Let's say that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Anytime you have a lima or a nema, it's going to be rejected. So you know that it's from the beginning, it's giving you a hint. Lima, let's say this. You know that the answer is going to be like, meh. We're not saying that. We don't say that in the end. So then, your question is like, why are we bothering? And if you're telling me from the beginning, right, we're not even engaging with this idea in good faith, because from the beginning, you're using this term, lema, nema. I know that this is going to fail. Why are we spending time in the Gemara on a failed proposal? So that's our question. But before we get to that answer, we do this all over the place. Lema and nema are these words that appear. They're like half the keywords in the Gemara. No, that's not really true, but right, this is not even the full list of phrases where lema and nema come in. So lema, baha kamipalge. Let's say they disagree about this. So that's when the Gemara attempts to reframe a disagreement between two Tanaim or two Amoraim to be about some more fundamental issue. And then the attempted reframe is rejected. So by the way, this is something like, if you take ever like psychologists or pastoral training or anything like that, like, oh, like it seems like they're arguing about this, but like really they're arguing about something much more fundamental, right? Seems like they're arguing over a ring, but really they're arguing about who their mother loved more, whatever it is, right? That's what this attempt, lima bahakama palge, is really all about. And the Gemara does it successfully many times. Oh, this debate, it seems like they're just talking about shofar. Really, they're talking about whether mitzvot need kavana or whatever it is, right? That'll be that happens all over the Gemara, where the Gemara will attempt to like almost like psychologize a debate or make it attach it to some bigger debate or something like that. And when it begins with lema, it's usually going to be rejected, but sometimes it does not begin with lema, and it actually is a successful analysis or evaluation of an argument. Okay, next, lema katanai. So this would be, we have a disagreement between Amoraim, and we're going to try and paint that disagreement on to a seemingly equivalent disagreement between Tanaim. So, right, a debate between rabbis in the Talmud, we're going to try and paint it onto a debate or rabbis in the Gemara. We're going to try and paint it onto a debate of rabbis in the Mishnah. So Tanaim, and when it begins with lema, it's going to fail almost always. The vast majority of the time, the Gemara is going to go on to reject the equivalency. The reason why the Gemara wants to reject the equivalency is because if two Tanaim had this debate already, then why are two Amoraim having that debate like in their own language? They should just argue out, oh, I paskin by Rabbi Meir, I paskin by Rabbi Akiva, whatever it is, right? They should just be having that debate in the language of the Tanaim instead of in their own language. That's kind of a piece of the problematic that Lima Ketanai is trying to come against. And because of that problematic, it's usually raised up as like a havamina about the Amoraic debate, and then gets rejected. No, there's actually some kind of difference between what these Amoraim are debating and what the Tanaim are debating. So it begins with lema, it gets rejected, and there's other language that it will use for that same idea when it does get accepted. Okay, next, Lima Messiah. Should we say that the following evidence supports him? So this will introduce proof from a Tannaitic text that will support an Amora's teaching. That proof gets rejected. It doesn't mean that there's no proof. It just means that this ain't it. Like that there's actually different proof or something like that. And again, it'll be an attempt and then a failed attempt. And right, these are all cases where the Gemara is like failing forward, right? So it's like, oh, we're attempting it, it's failing, and I'm learning something important from the failed attempt. Also, again, lima tave tiyuvta. Should we say there's a refutation of an opinion, typically of an amora? So it'll introduce an attempted refutation. That attempt will fail. It begins with a lema, it begins with a, oh, I hava mina that this that there's a refutation. It doesn't mean that there won't ever be a refutation. There might be, it just won't be this one. We're going to attempt a refutation, but from the beginning, you as a reader have a tip off that it's going to fail. Okay, so just a lot, hava minas all over the place. Why do we have so many hava minas? First of all, they help us understand statements, claims, and ideas in more pointed, more clear ways. Does this claim mean X? No, it does not. But if I didn't answer that question, if I never got that question, first of all, maybe the person who's reading wouldn't know that the claim doesn't mean X. And second of all, maybe I wouldn't have clarified my idea in the way that the raising of a hava mina and the rejection of it gets me to. So, right, the same thing. Is this statement the same as someone else's? No, it's different. And now instead of just saying, oh, statement A exists and statement B exists, now because that Havamina was raised, I get to articulate the difference between statement A and statement B to you in a way that's much more clear. So Havaminas make us better readers of texts, encourages us to ask more detailed questions, think more carefully about the text in question as we articulate responses to Havaminas. The Havamina logic is one of the Talmud and frankly Judaism's primary pedagogic tools. I'm telling you A because otherwise you would have concluded B, and it is important that you not conclude B. It is important to me that you not conclude B. All right, so we're still in the world of Havamina. We already saw a tzrichata, but here we're gonna just zoom in on this like tzrichata version of a Havamina. It's a little bit more complicated. It involves multiple steps of Havaminas, and it's all over the Gemara. So I want to make sure we're clear about it. Okay, so it's tzrichata means like it is necessary. It's often introduced by terms itzrich or tzricha. And it's a line of argument that comes to prove that two teachings or verses are not redundant. So as I mentioned a second ago, these types of logic often involve two levels of Havamina. So one, we'll have a Havamina that the teachings are redundant. And then two, we'll introduce a second Havamina of what might you have wrongly thought if there had only been one of the teachings, thereby proving that both teachings are necessary, disproving Havamina number one. So Havamina number one in a tzrichata is always these teachings are redundant. Havamina number two is going to disprove Havamina number one. All right, so here we go. So we're in Masachet Rosh Hashanah 25b. We're declaring the new month. So we kind of still we do like a fake version of this now, right? And we'll bless the new month. That's not declaring the new month. That is blessing the new month. But one of the reasons why we liturgically do that, in addition to just like making sure that everyone in the congregation and Jews around the world are on the same page about how the Hebrew calendar works, one of the other reasons why we do that is it harkens back to this core idea of Judaism, which is that months are determined by people, by the Beit Din, and that's how it used to work. So there would be witnesses, they would see the new moon, they would go to the temple, they would say to the Beit Din, we saw the new moon. They would examine the witnesses and the evidence and blah, blah, blah. And then they would announce, okay, it's Rosh Chodesh. But the problem is, what if those witnesses come really late in the day? Is today still Rosh Chodesh if those witnesses don't arrive until 2 seconds before twilight? Can today still be Rosh Chodesh even? What happens? So that's where this Mishnah comes in. So Ra'uhu Beit Din V'Chol Yisrael, if the court and all of the Jewish people saw the new moon, Nachkaru Ha'idim, and the witnesses were interrogated, V'lo Ispiku Lomar Mikudash, Ad Shecha, but the court did not manage to say sanctified before nightfall. So the 30th day had already passed, right? That 30th day could either be the first day of the new month or the 30th day of the old month. If the Beit Din on that day did not manage to say the words to announce Mikudash, the month is sanctified, by the time it is nightfall, Harezeh Mu'ubar, then the previous month would be a full month, a pregnant month, would be an more accurate translation of Mu'bar. So that makes the previous month, so let's say whatever, Cheshvan would then be a 30-day month, and Kislev is then only going to start after the 30 days of Cheshvan. So you could have had a 29-day Cheshvan and then it's Kislev. Nope, in this case you had a 30-day Cheshvan, and then the first day of Kislev follows after that, because they did not get to articulate Mekudash until the new month had until the sun had already set on that 30th day. Okay, so the Gemara is going to say, Lama lila mitnei ra'uhu beit din v'kol Yisrael. So the Gemara has this question on the first line of our Mishnah. Why does it say if the court and all of the Jewish people saw the new moon? Doesn't that seem redundant? Because the only people who matter in this situation are the court. It's not like, oh, the court is not in session or something, so in their absence, all the Jewish people just declare it's the new month. No, like when you have a court and they're declaring new months, they're the only people that matter. They're the only people capable of declaring a new month. Okay, so lama li lamitna ra'uhu beit din v'kol Yisrael. Itzrich, it is needed. So that's our trichata word, itzrich, right? It is needed. Silka daitach amina, and that's our hava amina word. In case I would have thought, or as it might enter your mind to say, that's how they translate it in the Quran. Hoyo vera'uhu beit din v'kol Yisrael, since they all saw it, the whole Jewish people saw it, the court saw it, then Iparsima, it was publicized. Everyone saw it, it wasn't like, oh, subtle, there was cloud coverage, oh, these two people had to see it, okay, now we have witnesses. Da, da, da. No, everyone saw it. You just like it didn't get declared B'Kudash until after the sunset, but like it was obvious. You might have thought, therefore, that it would actually just be Rosh Chodesh anyways, and that 30th day of the month would be Rosh Chodesh. And that we don't need to, and that's now Aleph Kislev. We don't need to have Loli Abra. We don't need to make Loli Abra. We don't need to make that 30th day like a full month. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who saw it. All of Israel saw it. The court saw it with their own eyes. It doesn't matter. You need witnesses. You got to do the whole process. They have to declare Mikudash on time. Kamash Malan. It doesn't matter. Okay, so right, Havamina number one is that the court and the Jewish people is a redundancy because only the court counts. So the Trichata comes along and introduces a Havamina number two. No, if it had just said the court, then you might have thought that in a case where if everyone saw it alongside the court, then they don't need to intercalate the month. They don't need to add in an extra day into Cheshvan. So therefore, it has to say both the court and the Jewish people in order to teach that even if everyone saw it, still requires a full court declaration before the end of the day. It doesn't matter how many people saw it, doesn't matter how obvious it is, none of that matters. Only witnesses, court hearing, declaration, that's how you make a day into Rosh Chodesh. And if that doesn't happen before sunset, doesn't matter how many people saw the new moon, that's all that counts. So, okay, so just to review, right? We have our Havamina of redundancy. No, it's not redundant because if I had only taught one of them, you might have thought something that would be wrong. Therefore, we had to teach two of them. Kamash Malan. That's what's coming to teach. Okay, so Tzrichata in normal life, right? Our house is being cleaned tomorrow. Please put away your toys. Havamina number one. This is redundant. Of course, I know to put away my toys before the house gets cleaned. Okay, this is what I'm calling like a tzrichata havamina two. Oh, you might have thought that the cleaning crew will put away your toys for you. Therefore, both need to be stated. The house is being cleaned tomorrow and put away your toys. So that right that the in a tzrichata, the first havamina is always a claim of redundancy. It's always I would have thought that these two terms or these two phrases or these two rulings or whatever it is do not both need to be stated. One would have sufficed. That's always havamina number one in a tzrichata. Havamina number two in a tzrichata is going to disprove havamina number one. What would I have thought? Right? So what would I have thought experiment? What would I have thought if you had only taught one of those things? If you had just said, our house is being cleaned tomorrow, maybe I would have said, great. And they're going to clean around my toys, or they're going to put my toys away for me. So that's why I needed to tell you both. Kamash Malan. I need to tell you both that our house is being cleaned tomorrow and that you need to put away your toys. Okay. I meant to say at the outset, I keep bringing all these like hyper domestic examples, and it's not really because like, oh, it's Hadran and it's women and it's whatever. It's really just like where my head is at as a mom. And I come up with these examples during the week, and then I'll be like, oh, I just use a tzrichata on my kids, like, and then I put them onto my slide. So it's not about you; it's 100% about me. But I also think that as I was just continuing to like think about why I keep using these domestic examples, there's something to be said for it, which is that like I keep meeting women always who are like, oh, in high school they taught me that like women are too stupid to learn Gemara, or like their minds are too soft, or whatever it is. And like here it's like this is a classic example of like a tzrichata that people have probably used in their homes a million times. And when we can say, oh, Talmud logic is actually something that people are using even in these like classically feminine domestic spheres, it to me that's like where you really get to the breakdown of that claim that like women are too soft or like our brains don't work right. Like, no, we're doing it. We're doing it all the time. Like, you don't want to learn Gemara, you don't want to teach women Gemara, do that for your own reasons, whatever. But don't claim that we can't do it, right? Because like anyone who's ever said our house is being cleaned tomorrow, put away your toys, in their head, the reason why they added in that second one was this tzrichata logic. Okay. We have a lot of time left. I know it's like, oh, there's only 3 slides left, but we need the time for ping pong. Okay. I spent all week trying to figure out, I need to fix my shades. Hold on one second. Okay. Sorry. I think this is just how we're gonna look. I'm so sorry. Okay. I spent all week trying to find a Hebrew word for this term, Hebrew or Aramaic or something, and I was not successful. Come over here. No, no. Okay, none of that helps. Okay, here we go. I just sit really far away. Okay, so I spent a lot of time trying to find a Hebrew word for ping pong. I asked Rabbanit Michelle what she uses, and she says, I call this ping pong. I don't usually call this ping pong. I call it, or actually, I think on the next slide we have it. Oh, I didn't put in all the other terms for it. I call it every shirt needs a hanger, every hanger needs a shirt. Some people say like it's a parking lot and every car needs a space and every space needs a car, things like that. But it's basically this Talmudic concept where every word in the Torah teaches just one halacha. Every word in the Torah teaches just one halacha. So you might have, well, we're going to do this in the abstract first, and then we're going to see it applied, and then we're going to do a piece of vocabulary. So that's where we're heading with this. Okay, so Rabbi X says halacha 1 is derived from word A. Rabbi Y says halacha 2 is derived from word A. Now you might be saying to yourself, okay, like last week we learned about the school of Rabbi Akiva, who learns different halachot from all the different crowns on the letters. And each crown he learns tilei tilim shel halachot, right? Mounds and mounds of halachot. Like, what's the problem? Okay, Rabbi X and Rabbi Y learned 2 different halachot from word A, no problem at all. So that may or may not be what Rabbi Akiva thought, but that is not where the Gemara ends up. So by the time you have the stam of the stam of the Gemara feels really strongly that this is not an acceptable way of being. So the fact that halacha 1 is derived from word A and halacha 2 is derived from word A is a problem, unless Rabbi X and Y maybe don't agree on halacha 1 and 2. Like, it could, for example, be the case that Rabbi X says halacha 1 is derived from word A, and Rabbi Y says halacha 2 is derived from word A, and that's not a problem for me because I don't hold by halacha 1. And that would be okay in the eyes of the Gemara, because everyone's keeping the same rule that every word in the Torah teaches one halacha, but we don't all have the same set of halachot. And everyone needs to put every word in the Torah to work somehow, for the most part. And everyone needs to attach every halakha to some word in the Torah. But if we have different sets of halachot, then maybe we're organizing our two collections of words in the Torah and halachot in not the same way. So once you have these two statements, Rabbi X, halacha 1 is derived from word A, Rabbi Y, halacha 2 is derived from word A, the next question is going to be, hold on, so does Rabbi X hold by halacha 2? And if Rabbi X holds by halacha 2, right, it's easy. If Rabbi X doesn't hold by halacha 2, no problem. And especially if Rabbi Y also doesn't hold by halacha 1. They just have disagreement opinions. They learn it both from the same word. That's totally fine. But what happens when Rabbi X does hold halacha 2? Well, he has to derive it from word B. He can't derive halacha 1 and halacha 2 from the same word, or at least not, it gets stretched sometimes, so it can be from the same syllable or from the same piece of the word, like, learn something from the shoresh and something from the root of the word and something from the way the word is articulated, or something from the prefix of the word or the suffix of the word, or something in that direction. That's allowed. You can tear words apart a little bit, but you can't learn this two of the same halachot from two, so you can't learn two halachot from the same exact word. Okay, right? So that's the origin of ping pong, is this assumption by the stam that every word in the Torah teaches one halacha corresponds to one word, and if you have two rabbis teaching different things from the same word, then you're going to have a problem. So here's kind of how this will start to play out. So we have a braita where Rebbe says, Kriyat Shema kichtava. Shema must be recited as it's written. So in Hebrew, for example, Divrei Rebbe. This is the statement of Rebbe Yehuda HaNasi. And the rabbis say, no, Kriyat Shema b'kol lashon. Shema can be recited in any language, says the rabbis. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to say, my taima de Rebbe. What is the reasoning? My taima, also very classic Gemara phrase. We've talked about it before. What is the reasoning of Rebbe? And we've talked about before how Tanaitic statements in general, if they're in Midrash Halacha texts, then they will include their origins. But if they're in more like Mishnah style texts, they often won't attach themselves directly to psukim, and then the Gemara is always going to be asking, where did this come from? Minayin, right? Different, and there's a few different ways to ask that question. Minahani mili, from where are these things derived? Here we're asking that same question in a different way. My taima de Rebbe, what is the reason for Rebbe's opinion? And the Gemara there answers, Amar Kra vehayu, bahavayatan yihiu. Will be means vehayu, right? Vehayu advarim ha'ilai, or maybe people are familiar with Kriyat Shema. Vehayu means as they are, so shall they be. So vehayu behavayatan yihu, Kriyat Shema has to be written, has to be said the way it is written. Okay, V'Rabbanan my ta'amayu, and what is the reason for the rabbi's opinion? Amar Kra, the pasuk says Shema. The pasuk says here, it's stated here, B'chol lashon she'ata shomeh, in any language that you can hear and understand. Okay, so far, right, we have Rebbe teaching a halacha, Kriyat Shema kichtava, Shema must be recited as it's written, and learned out from pasuk v'hayu. Rabbanan have a different halacha, an opposing halacha, and they learn it out from the word Shema. And so now we're going to get to the following question, which only makes sense once you know the rules of ping pong, which is that every shirt has a hanger, every hanger has a shirt, right? Every halacha must be attached to one pasuk, and each pasuk can only teach one halacha. So then the Stam says, "Ulu Rebbe nami haktiv shma," but according to Rebbe, isn't the word shma also there? So he has to learn something out from the word shma too. What does he learn out from it? Hahu mibayalei. Oh, he needs it. Hashmala aznecha masha ta motzi mipicha. Make your ears hear what your mouth utters. So he says he learns a different halacha from the word shema. So Rabbanan used the word shema to say, yep, shema can be recited in any language. Rebbe says, I also learned something out from the word shema, but it's not that. What I learned out from the word shema is that you have to hear yourself say kriyat shema. And then they say, okay, we have this new halacha that's now in play in our game of ping pong. Rabbanan savrila command amar lo hishmiel no yatsa. So then they say Rabbanan, right? So the rabbis, do they hold this same halacha that Rebbe learns from Shema? And remember, if they did, and they also learned it from Shema, then the Rabbanan would have a problem, right? Because Shema is already taken. Shema comes to teach you that you can say Shema in whatever language. So if they hold that same halacha that Rebbe just introduced of you have to hear it, and they also learn that from Shema, you would have a problem because now Shema is teaching two halachot and Shema is not allowed to teach two halachot. So they say, oh, there's no problem. They don't hold by that second halacha. Savrila, kamandamar, lo ishmiel yatsa. Right? They hold that someone who says Shema and can't hear it has fulfilled his obligation, so they don't have to hear that rule from Shema. And then they go back and they say, the same question that they asked Rebbe about Shema, they're going to ask Rabbanan about Vahayu. So Rabbanan, Nami Haktiv Vahayu, the rabbis, they also have the word Vahayu in their Torah. So what do they learn from it? Hahumabailahu Shalo Ikra Lemafreya. They need it to teach a different halacha, right? So Rebbe uses Vahayu to teach that the words of Shema have to be said the way that they're written. Rabbanan don't agree with that. And so now we have, okay, so what do they use the word Vahayu to teach us? It teaches, it's required so that you would know to not recite the Shema out of order. Okay, so then they say, all right, Rebbe, your turn. But Rebbe, shelo yikra lemafreya minale. Rebbe, from where do you learn that you should not read Shema out of order? It says, oh, he has a different word in the Torah that teaches him that. Nafkale mi dvarim ha-dvarim. So this is a little bit complicated. I mentioned before that you can learn midrash halacha from like portions of words. So that's kind of what's happening here. So from the fact that it doesn't just say dvarim, but it says ha-dvarim, right? V'hayu ha-dvarim ha'ila, not just v'hayu dvarim ila, let's say. So from the fact that it says ha-dvarim, midvarim ha-dvarim, that's how you know it's these words it employs the definite article, these words in this order, right? Everyone, right? Until now, we've only seen them have halachic disagreements. Here we're seeing them actually have a halachic agreement, but the problem is Vahayu is already taken for Rebbe. So Rabbanan learned this idea that Shema needs to be cited in order from the term Vahayu, but Rebbe has that same halacha. He can't learn it from Vahayu because for him, Vahayu, again, is already taken. Vahayu means Bahavayatan Yehu, that they have to be read as they are, i.e. in Hebrew. So he learns it out from Dvarim ha-Dvarim. Rabbi learns it out from somewhere different. Then they say, okay, Rabbanan, what do you learn out from Dvarim ha-Dvarim? What do you learn out from the definite article of ha-Dvarim ha-Ila? Lo darshe. No, we don't need something to learn from that definite article. That's fine. It's allowed. So here's where you see it start to have some flexibility. Not only do we have halachic flexibility, you can get out of a ping pong match by saying, I don't need to find somewhere to hang that halacha because I don't have that halakha. That's one way out. And if you say, oh, I don't need a use for this term, it's not like, oh, I don't have that word in the Torah. No, for sure you have that word in the Torah, but you can say, oh, like that hey on that word, I don't learn something specific out from it. That I don't have to learn a unique halacha out from that specific hey. So again, we're talking about Rabbanit Michelle calls it a ping pong match. Every hanger needs a coat. Every coat needs a hanger. V'hayu has to mean something to everyone. Shema has to mean something to everyone. You have to learn a halacha from it according to the rules of ping pong. But we don't have to agree about the halacha. We don't have to learn the same thing from each word. But every time a new term or a new halacha is introduced, it gets thrown back at the other person, and so that's why a lot of the people who have names for it, they're like game themed names, gamified names, because that's sort of what it is. Like, oh, you sent me Vahayu, Zoom, I'm sending Vahayu right back at you with this new halacha. Uh-oh, okay, I have to pick up this new halacha and I have to tell you where it's associated. Okay, but now you have a new word in the Torah that you don't have anything to do with. Uh-oh, you're in trouble. Oh, shoot, no, I caught it. I can tell you what I can do with that word. So that's the image of ping pong that's kind of being implied here. Okay, so hopefully people understood, if not the specifics of like all the halacha stuff we just did. Obviously, I went through way too fast for that, but this back and forth model of I use this word for this halacha, I use this other word for this halacha. Okay, what do you do with my word? What do I do with your word? What do you do with this halacha? What do you do with the other halacha? And again, like if we hold different halachot from different words, no problem. The problem becomes same halacha from one word, that's a problem. Or you learn this halacha from this word, but I learned that halacha, but not from that word, so I have to account for that halacha from a different word. So every word needs accounting, every halacha needs accounting, and you can't hang too much on one word. So that's where you start to find problems and puzzles and complexity. I just wanted to point out one vocab word, mibaile. So this term ba'i appears all over the Gemara. There's a few different ways to say out what it can mean. Desire, require, inquire is a fun one to understand the different meanings of ba'i. So, or I want it, I like it, I need it. That's another way. But I like desire, require, inquire. That's very fun. But it'll often come up in ping pong. Well, he needs it. He requires the word shema in order to teach that you have to make your ears hear what your mouth utters, right? And again, I just underlined it in both, right? So the rabbis also have this term vahayu. Oh, they need it for something else. So that term mibaile requires it, is gonna come up often in ping pong, in the logical form that we are beautifully calling calling ping pong. All right. That is what I have for you today. We covered a lot of material really quickly just now. And I am available for questions. People should definitely feel free to put into the chat. Hopefully by next week we'll figure out some solution to this afternoon lighting problem that I'm having. Maybe if I futz with my shades a little bit more, you won't have stripes across my face. But people are very invited to put questions into the chat. Give that a minute. And then yeah, so just the preview to next week, while people are maybe hopefully typing some questions or whatever. So the preview to next week is next week we're going to be doing evidentiary logic. So, and those of you who are actually holding the daf, this is going to be stuff that you're seeing now all the time in the Bavas and in the Zikin. This stuff, right, the examples I brought today were like all Moedim examples for the most part. And you'll see ping pong everywhere. Like no matter where you're learning, no matter where you're holding these exact questions, these exact tools. Havamina, it's on every page. Trichata, very, very common, right? You'll see that no matter where. The stuff for next week is more Nizikin and Nashim specific, anywhere that you have claims. That's really what we're going to be, an evaluation of evidence, but specifically claims, I think is what we're going to be talking about. And it's logic that applies all over the place and carries forward into like places in halacha that you would never have imagined. Um, but um, but it's like gonna feel very, very resonant for people who are holding in Nizikin right now with the daf. Okay, so Jody asks, is there another way to get out of the ping pong to say that Rabbi X means a different case than Rabbi Y? Yeah, 100%. Um, so you could say the problem, so the ping pong is almost always based on like has like a midrash halacha element to it, that it's almost always based on a verse or a pasuk. So you're still gonna get stuck on that, right? Like if I'm applying this pasuk to teach this halacha, even if that halacha is like different because it's a different case, that is still going to be that's still going to be a problem if they're depending on the same pasuk. But very frequently in a ping pong situation, you'll have no, I was talking about something different, but it still has to answer all those foundational questions. Um, but yes, that is a type of logic or a type of reasoning that will certainly get brought in. Mhm. Okay. So as with last week, I'm available to take questions in between. Um, what if there is no resolution? That happens sometimes in the Gemara. Good question. So yeah, sometimes it's just like, oh, we don't know. That so sometimes in the Gemara that'll be called a teku, which means like in modern Hebrew, a teku means a tie, which is cute. Um, and some people understand teku to mean to be a Rosh Tevot for Tishbif, Tor, Kushiot, Uviot, that like Elijah will resolve all of these questions. And that's also like a fun, right? There's no such thing as a tie. Because also sometimes in the Gemara you have a teku on extremely practical questions. And then you're like, okay, that's so fun that you can't resolve that, but like, how do I live my life now? And so that is a thing that like the history of halakha has had to deal with when the Gemara doesn't have a resolution, but like ultimately you want to be a Jew in the world. Um, so yeah, so sometimes there's no resolution within the Gemara, but lived halakha and like the history of halakha have devised a resolution nevertheless. Also, sometimes when there's no resolution, the no resolution is to like a ping pong rules problem and not a how do I live problem. So what I mean by that is like, oh, I don't know how you could possibly hold halacha A and halacha B as being learned out from this one pasuk. So like, okay, maybe that's an unresolvable problem, but I still know like whether I can eat this chicken or not at the end of it. Like it's not as practical. So both, yeah, like sometimes there's no resolution, sometimes there's no resolution and it really matters that there's no resolution, and sometimes there's no resolution and it's like, okay. Um, okay, can you say more about Midrash Halacha and how it relates to the Gemara? Good. So we've actually done this before in previous, not that's it's still a good question and I'm going to answer it, but if you want like a fuller treatment of this, that I believe that in session 2, the second class is on this question. No, that was about Stam. Delete that. Maybe one of them. We did a full like Midrash Halacha. Maybe it's in the first session. We did a full Midrash Halacha class at some point, but it's actually really interesting and complicated question. So when you look at Tannaitic literature, you have the Mishnah, you have the Tosefta. Then there's Midrash Halacha. Midrash Halacha is like the Sifra, the Sifrei, Mechilta. And there's a lot of overlapping material discussed in those two things, but they're discussed in very different ways because like the Sifra or the Sifrei or the Mechilta is going to go pasuk by pasuk on the Sefer of the Torah that they're centered on. And the Mishnah is going topically. So the Mishnah is going to say, great, now we're discussing Peah, not like now we're discussing Sefer Shmut, so they're organized totally differently. And Midrash Halacha is going to take you from the pasuk to the halachic debate, and the Mishnah is usually not even going to quote the pasuk at all, and that's where the Gemara comes in. The Gemara is very, very interested on one of the first questions the Gemara is thinking for every Mishnah is Minahani Mili, like where does this come from? How did we learn this? So the Gemara, one of the core functions of the Gemara is to reattach Midrash Halacha to the Mishnah. So that's something that happens all over the Gemara. And when you're learning Gemara, if you're like really like benachat, taking all the time in the world, which obviously a Daf Yomi learner is not, but in a different version of a Gemara class, you would learn a Mishnah, go back to the psukim that Mishnah is based on, go forward to all the Midrash Halacha, compare the Midrash Halacha and relevant Tosefta to the Mishnah, and you do all of that before you would ever open the Gemara. So that's like a very different version. That's called Iyun. And even then, you could go to an Iyun class and they would never open up a Sifra, right? So it's just a different like practice or shita in relation to how you learn these texts. Also because like the next question is, what about material that exists in Midrash Halacha that doesn't make its way into the Gemara? So a really big example of that is about or not, I mean, there are many big examples of that, but one that affects a lot of the lives of women is this idea, Som tasim alach malach, it says in Dvarim, and the Midrash says malach velo malka. A king and not a queen, and therefore we learn out from that issues of strara, issues of like halachic issues with women having positions of power. So that actually doesn't appear in the Gemara, but the Rambam brings it in. So then the question is, what do the Rishonim do with it? Do they treat it as if it's in the Gemara, or do they not treat it as if it's in the Gemara? And that's why, just as like one example, to say like, if you're a master of the Gemara, you've done Daf Yomi 80 times, but you never learned before, during, and after the Gemara, you're missing a lot of the conversation, right? Like you could learn the whole Gemara and have no idea that this concept of like it being problematic, potentially at least for women to hold positions of power, even exists. And then it's like 1948 and you're the state of Israel and you're trying to figure out whether you're going to give women the right to vote. And people are throwing around texts that you've never heard of, even though you've learned all of Shas 3 times with Daf Yomi, So that's why, by the way, if you ever like want to do a really fun research project, those materials are fascinating. The debates about what is voting, just for people who are listening from America now, it's like a little bit relevant, right? Like, what is voting? How powerful is it to cast a vote? All of that stuff. And like, is it a violation of Strara? Does Strara still apply? Like, like that actually, one of the really interesting points in Jewish history where that really came to a head was when they were determining in Israel whether women would get the right to vote. So, and all that happens like in Midrash Halacha and then post Gemara. So just like a very fascinating kind of trail that gives also sheds some light on how complicated the Torah library is. I know it's fun when like very few people have questions and you ask one. I can really get going here. Okay. All right. I think we're gonna wrap. I don't know if Maggie's still on here. But if not, I
I'm
will
here. I'm
say,
here. I'm
oh,
here.
you're here. Okay. Do you want to say a few words?
I wanted to say thank you to you, Rabbanit Leah Sarna, and to everyone who joined us tonight. We will meet you next week, and sometime between now and next week, we will send you quiz for lesson 2, correct?
Yeah.
All right. Have a good week, everyone.
See you next week.